The next 2 months at the portal will be exploring Christianity in transition. This 2-month process will involve two major sections. To learn more or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Cadell Last, and I'm here today with Christian Baxter. Christian is a Christian YouTuber building a channel called Yours Truly within a larger movement, mostly started by Paul Vanderklay and titled the TLC, or This Little Corner. In this conversation, we're going to be talking about the history of Christian's work in this space, how he sees this space, online Christianity, its relationship to actual physical church movements, and some of the currents in contemporary American Christianity, potentially Western Christianity, and beyond. And ultimately, all of this is a part of our next month in the portal. In the portal, we have been building, in the month of March, the start of a series called Christianity in Transition, where we're working through the emerging church movement. We're working through deconstructive theology, its relationship to reconstructive theology, a little bit of the relationship between metamodernism and Christianity. And next month in the portal, this April, we are going to be moving more into thinking about a concept that has become very popular in the TLC, metagelicalism. And hopefully we'll be able to talk to Christian a little bit about how he sees that concept, as well as how metagelicalism describes the TLC and potentially its relationship to Christianity outside of the online space as well. So welcome to the conversation, Christian. Why don't you just maybe tell us a little bit about your background and maybe a little bit about the Yours Truly podcast, and then we'll get into this.
Good. Thanks, Cadell. Yeah, man, it was great to connect with you in the way that it only can seem to happen in the digital space. It happens fast. And that's one of the distinctives, I think, that the digital versus the embodied that I've been playing with. But as far as for me, I'm how do I put this? I'm a country bumpkin. I'm from the South in the United States, in Arkansas. You know, we have one state that seems to always beat us in having worse educational records, so we're not the very worst. So I just am starting with, like, sometimes the fact that I find myself in kind of deep philosophical waters are shocking to me, but I'm glad to be here. I was kind of raised in the American Southern evangelical milieu of some charismaticism, Southern Baptist, was educated at a Southern Baptist college and got my undergrad in biblical studies, worked within evangelical churches and kind of parachurch Christian organizations doing a lot of the what's been called modern worship, which is a rock ensemble with cool lights and stuff. You know, it's the influence here. And yeah, so that was my identity. It was a big part of life. And, you know, in the words that are used a lot within what's happened within American evangelicalism or Protestantism related to postmodernism is deconstruction. And I know in your last series on Christianity in transition, that's been a big theme. The way that I felt like that was different for me was not deconstruction, but destruction. And I, you know, I'm living in this Christian life. You know, I'm dealing with, you know, I'm on staff at a church and I'm dealing with things like the new atheists contending for, can I put confidence in this thing that I'm staking my career on? Is this true? Is this delusional? And all those things. But the whole time, not knowing how to, within that culture, deal with certain parts of my life, certain shadows, certain things that, you know, sins. And as a result, I broke the trust within my marriage, broke the trust of my church and my community, and was fired from being a pastor, worship pastor at a church. And in that process, you know, my identity, my reputation, I had a band that I also traveled with and did events and stuff. Like, you know, we had our own little website and we kind of toured around on weekends throughout the year and different stuff. Everything gone. And then I had to, when you talk about betraying people's trust, that is directly tied to dealing with truth and truthfulness. And that's also been a part of like an epistemological journey that I've been on, related to when I was looking at the New Atheist, and they're dealing with things within a epistemic framework related to Christianity. And in my mind, I thought that, oh, if I have the true facts, then my life will work and this will be figured out. But what I found in that kind of destructive mode was that, not only had I betrayed trust in my marriage and betrayed trust of this church that they had put into me as to be a leader with integrity and all this stuff, I'd betrayed myself, and what I thought I believed, and what it meant, not only to say within that whole argument of believing, is this true? There's something like more ontological, which is, am I as a person truthful? And so that was what I had to begin to wrestle with. And in that wrestling, I had a very visceral spiritual experience. I had a vision of Abraham's dagger coming down over Isaac. And in my mind, me having to make the choice, am I going to allow that dagger to come down, and the cost of like trust related to what is actually true about my life, am I willing to trust that telling the full truth is better than like trying to preserve the control that I've tried to preserve for so many years of my life? And in that, through that kind of, I call it like a subconscious Jungian experience, I was able to kind of understand what I thought was something like an archetypal truth. And I made the decision to trust that. And then I told the whole truth and began a practice of truth telling and confession in my life. And, through therapy, through a relationship with my wife, and through friendships and all those kinds of things. And so that whole journey, I'd had a website and was public and that kind of way before. 6 years, 7 years, I just sat in the church pews with my family, went to work, went to therapy. And then at about a little over a year ago, I was trying to articulate ideas of things that had happened. And so when I mentioned Jungian archetypes and this kind of symbol of Abraham's dagger, I wasn't given a lot of resource on how to interpret and kind of make sense and meaning out of that situation through my evangelical Southern Baptist reality. And there were the figures of Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot related to Peterson's psychological work with kind of Jung, and then and his synthesis in his college lecture series. And then Jonathan Peugeot's talking about symbology, mythos, stories, their power, and also Peterson's ideas about like the metaphorical substrate, or of reality being based on those, that began to like say, how did a story from 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, at least in the traditional context of critical history, do that to me? So that just set me on a long, quiet journey of YouTube, taking in that information. And then when a year ago, I kind of was trying to articulate some of these ideas to some friends, and I just couldn't really get there. And I saw Paul Vanderklay, who I'd watched him do synthesis on Peterson's work for, 6-7 years at that point. I just randomly clicked on one, and there was this community of people talking and discussing these ideas, and on a Friday live stream that he was doing. And I was like, what is this? I haven't seen this part of this before. And then all of a sudden I realized, oh, there's something here. I think subconsciously I realized that. So I turned on the camera. I had built this studio because I'd done a lot of music, thinking that, and I bought a camera. I was trying to maybe start doing a few covers on like Instagram. And I just said, this little corner of the internet and how I see it. And I kind of outlined this kind of metaphor of Peterson being like this kind of, St. Peterson the First, and the Peugeot and John Vervaeke and Paul Vanderklay doing this thing and kind of creating this dialogical relationship through the digital space of relationality that was taking place And I kind of just started, I talked about that, and we'll get into like that journey, but over the course of the year, but that it had some feedback. There were like 500 views overnight and like 50 comments. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. And so then there's that feedback, and I kind of just started to play on the internet. So I think that kind of lines out some of it.
There's a lot there that I'd love to go into, but I want to start with developing a theme from, of course, this month in the portal, we were working with deconstructive theology, and we had a conversation with Jim Palmer, who's a deconstructive theologian, about his relationship to evangelicalism, specifically deconstructing his faith and now trying to think about what reconstruction might mean. But I want to bring up the distinction you made about destruction. So, like deconstruction versus destruction, and how there could be something potentially, I don't want to say more honest, but kind of like pointing in that direction, because we even discussed in our conversation about Christian atheism how I kind of came to the truth of the Christian perspective through almost like a personal destruction. And I'm just kind of trying to get at what might be more honest there is when we deconstruct rationally what we think, we're still kind of using our own rational cognition to do that. But when you experience a personal destruction and you're kind of committed to finding the truth in that complete collapse, there's a kind of way in which you're bringing your reason to something which transcends your reason. Because obviously, if it didn't transcend your reason, the destruction wouldn't have happened in the first place.
Right.
Right. So I just want to get your opinion maybe on how you're feeling into, or how you felt into in the past, deconstruction and the deconstructive lens versus kind of the experience of like a personal devastation or a
Mm-hmm.
personal destruction,
Mm-hmm.
and what you've learned from being open to learning from that destruction and learning from that, which is an intimate experience. I could go on, but maybe that's enough.
Yeah, so kind of a contrast between maybe those two ideas, because yeah, I mean, I'd been hearing about, having my pulse on Christian culture, and people talking about their faith deconstructing, and even before, whenever like I was fired, that was 2016. So even before that, for several years on social media, there was kind of, a lot of deconstruction, and honestly, if I'm being completely honest, a lot of that to me appeared as a rejection of a culture. Like it appeared to me on the level of like, well, the evangelical, conservative world that I was operating and community that I was operating with, is not affirming. They're not, maybe they're have like young earth, like that I was mentioning earlier before we, like they may hold to like they may not be like conscious about global warming, or like all those types of really politicized realities. And there was an intense amount of social pressure related to all of that, across the West. And I think that was like just pressing so hard. And then like that, and I think that was also related to social media. Alex O'Connor recently has kind of stated that the new atheist, people are saying the new atheist thing was a publishing phenomenon. I'd say something related to deconstruction is a social media phenomenon, because, and even as we get into these other ideas about like what's happening in this little corner of the internet, and, these figures that I've pointed to already with like Peterson and Show and others and Vanderklay, I was paying attention to many of those things, whether it's the politics, whether it's the, and as a person that was working at a relatively conservative church, I was like, oh, this is intense. You're feeling all those societal pressures of people rejecting this thing. And how do you relate and encourage, or, disciple would be a word or something like that. So that was my vantage point on deconstruction, was just kind of like, this doesn't seem to fit. This doesn't seem to fit. And you can make hermeneutical or exegetical arguments all day long to make it almost in a postmodern sense, in almost an infinite sense of trying to, choose how you want to interpret scripture. And so there's also this element of radical Protestantism of, this stance towards scripture called like the priesthood of all believers, which is that you as an individual are your own mediation between you and God, between Christ, and as a result, you're your own authority you're your own priest related to how to interpret the scripture. So I think you see all that, but it's not, in the traditions that would have hierarchical structures like the higher church traditions, there were plenty of people within the laity that they wouldn't have seen themselves deconstructing because they weren't even responsible for their own beliefs in a certain way. I think so they just were, they can just kind of flow along in a way in the political cultures, and it's the priests and whatnot and the bishops that are kind of wrestling with those things. And I don't think that's a very broad brush because there's plenty of people that take their individual faith very seriously within those traditions. But I would say that's a difference between something within Protestantism and evangelicalism related to deconstruction, and why it was so much more intense, because you didn't have necessarily a lot of Catholic people being like, I'm deconstructing my faith. It's mainly people from a Baptist or Pentecostal or charismatic background, evangelical Protestants.
So it's more Protestant phenomenon. The entire phenomenon of deconstruction is a more Protestant phenomenon in a way.
I would think so. I mean, that's very empirical. I don't read a lot of articles or anything like that, but because a lot of them then find solace within the high traditions. So I think that's part of the story. And I'll also bring in too that Paul, I'll credit Paul. He's where I've heard this. Paul Vanderklay is that he calls evangelicalism a marketplace of ideas, actually more than one singular thing. And so if you're in the marketplace of ideas, and you're grabbing this stuff and then you're having to kind of reconstruct or deconstruct, you're rejecting certain ideas, and so I think there's a great. This is the one thing that I brought to this the conversation that I heard John Mark Comer, who's an evangelical influencer pastor. He's kind of in line with people like Richard Foster and Dallas Willard, who are kind of held up as these evangelical mystics throughout the last century or so. And he's kind of in that line about more thinking about embodied practices of fasting and, prayer and communal experiences and stuff, where that's not been generally a big slice of evangelicalism, but he's kind of this next generation in that line. And I was listening to an interview about a year ago where he referenced Janet Hagberg and Robert Gulick's book, The Critical Journey: Stages of the Life of Faith. And it's 6 stages. And it's the first one's stage 1, recognition of God. Stage 2, life of discipleship. Stage 3, productive life. Stage 4, the journey inward. Stage 5, the journey outward. And stage 6, the life of love. And between the productive life and the inward journey, there's a wall. And that's either what I would consider the deconstruction thing, or it would be the destructive thing. And the difference being is it seems like the deconstructive loops back to the first part of the journey. And that was Comer's point, which is then I found a new framework. Oh, and now I'm being discipled by this new ideology. And now I'm being productive as an activist in this new ideology. And then you do all this stuff, and then it seems like that you come up to that same point if you see the wall and then you turn around. But going through the wall is much more destructive and painful, and then taking the journey inward, and so the way that outlined it really impacted me on how I was relating to my journey and my faith. So
what I wanted to emphasize in regards to how I'm coming at this is that there's this line in Lacan, psychoanalyst, when he's talking about one only comes to psychoanalysis through affective strife. So what he means by that is like you have to be going through something personally destructive, some sort of unconscious affective strife that you can't get rid of and that you can't ignore before psychoanalysis makes sense. And I think that he was against sort of people who came to psychoanalysis purely as an intellectual interest.
Mm.
And I think that I'm trying to make kind of like and it seems to me like, you know, what you just said there about someone who's deconstructing can easily sort of reconstruct just a new activist framework. And maybe it's because what really needs to break is some, like, that the framework itself needs to be shattered by this unquestionable pain or this unquestionable affective strife. And then that unquestionable pain, that unquestionable affective strife actually changes your mode of being in the world, so that your relationship to frames and your relationship to thinking is itself qualitatively different. Does that make sense to you, or how would you make sense of what I'm saying there?
Yeah, the only thing is I think I do want to be careful in thinking that I think in some deconstructions there is a lot of pain, even if it is kind of related more in this idea that I'm thinking like it's an exchange of ideas,
Totally.
and in that exchange you have to maybe you feel the need to reject your community, family, um, you know, a lot of your own history, and I think like a concern there is something I call it. This is crass. I call it like Martin Luthering yourself, because Martin Luther, you know, he seemed like in his journey out of Catholicism, he was just like beating himself up constantly. And it's like, and even in that kind of dialogical relationship between Lutheranism and Catholicism, and then this is very crass. I'm not a historian, I'm not a theologian based on this stuff, but kind of this perception of kind of a part of self-hatred that I think can come related to, oh, those damn those, you know, stupid evangelicals. It's like, yeah, I'm so much more enlightened. It's like, well, dude, that was like 20 years of your life. And so I think that that's a part of it. And related to, if we're talking about the psychoanalytic relationship, would be something along the lines of integration. How do you integrate that part of yourself that there's lots of things in there that maybe you dislike or that you don't really know where to put in yourself? And so, but then to the point of, you know, does something bring you to a, well, I would bring in the term, I don't know who's popularized it. I know somebody did. It's spiritual bypassing. And I think that is part of what it's easy to do, is to reject the ideas, but then not really deal with what is something like a spiritual change or pain. It's like, but if I get the new ideas into there, like, you know, I could reconstruct the idea space, then all is well, because now I have the truth. And so, as
Well
opposed,
said.
go ahead.
No, well said. Yeah, no, go ahead.
As opposed to, you are faced with like a situation where the pain of all that, like there needs to be, you know, a proper grief related to the loss or the rejection of that identity. And our culture is very bad at grieving. I would say something like through embodied practice. And however ways that may take, you know, there's stories of other cultures that when, you know, there's this wake culture, you know, of what do you do? You take a month and to just acknowledge the death of something in your life. So I think there's something there.
It brings me around to the other distinction I wanted to make related to deconstructive theology and the destructive moment is, and I'm bringing this up because you were saying this in your opening, of epistemology and ontology,
Yeah.
of sort of a mode of knowing how we think, which you can play around with rationally, versus your own personal being. And I think that distinction is important because, as far as I see it, and I've heard many people that you talk to speak in the same way, is that this online community that you find yourself associated with now are much more grounded in the personal and the ontological. Is that fair to say, or how would you make sense of that?
Yeah, from what I can understand, because really I've only been playing in this corner for like a year and a half, roughly, almost, not even that. But I tried to do my homework, and I think there was a long conversation through figures like Luke Thompson, who's got a channel called Whitestone Name, who hosts kind of live stream conversations a lot. And the intersection between Paul's synthesis of John Vervaeke's work related, and he's got a series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. He recently has a book out by the same term, but in that, the meaning crisis, which is really something we're dancing around with the ideas of deconstruction and destruction, it's a crisis of meaning. I think there was they began a long conversation about ontological relationality. Maybe I'm saying that right. And I had to brush up on my, philosophy, because I took philosophy 101 in my philosophy and religion department. So okay, that's like the ground of being. Epistemology is like knowledge and understanding, and truthy ideas. And there's different. So I had to kind of freshen up on that. So as I experienced this, and even what drew me into participation was the fact that it was relational. It wasn't just, oh, now I'm going to make YouTube videos and try to convince people of my great ideas. There's something relational happening in this space that Paul's kind of cultivated, Paul Vanderklay. And so, yes, I think that, and then that's constantly happening, kind of birthed out of the Peterson phenomenon related to New Atheism, which was this epistemological project. And so there's this relationship there where the conversation, like what's going on and what Peterson, the effect of the kind of collective unconscious or subconscious that he had on certain segments of population in the corner, people began to reconstruct their faith. Within that space, they were starting to do it within a digital community, and then it over time realized that there should be some priority about embodied community. So and that continues to happen. So I think that outlines some of what's happening, and there was a culture there that I think that I have a gift or a talent for looking at a subculture and seeing kind of the boundaries and the identities of it and being like, okay, I'm going to replicate that, because I did so much of that with the modern worship culture, taking it, seeing it, all the facets of it, and being like, well, here's what I think is good, and I'm just going to try to implement so much of these things. So I've kind of done this similarly, looking at this little corner of the internet, TLC, and imbibing the cultural, not necessarily all the depths of the conversations, but kind of the cultural realities of what I'm seeing play out.
So how is, I guess, the emphasis on ontological relationality, would you say that was largely absent or neglected in the forms of evangelical worship that you come from, or the larger American culture, or is it, or not? Basically, is this a repetition of what already existed? Is this a reconstruction of something that existed, or is this a kind of a reconstruction that is working with something that was lacking in the previous form?
I think that when I reference like a social media phenomenon, I think things have happened so fast in our culture. And as you know, I think you and I are fairly close in age as kind of millennials. I think things, postmodernism had been happening culturally writ large through television medium, but also at the academic level, filtering down, creating postmodern realities. But when it hit this deconstruction level, it's like it just went into absolute overdrive with it went viral. Like postmodernism went viral very quickly, and it disintegrated people's communities, and then we're all in the digital space. And what I've noticed sociologically, so when I was in college and The Office was still every Tuesday night and you couldn't watch it you couldn't stream it, some of us had gotten married, and so we had these little married apartments, and we'd invite our friends from the dorms, and we'd have a Office watch party, right? And you saw the end of that being a reality, I think, several years ago at the end of Game of Thrones, where shared experiences were becoming less and less and less and less. And then it's like, and you don't think you need it. It's like, oh, I can make my own playlist. I can make my curated Spotify, my curated Netflix experience. And then even with digital church or my digital, like now I have watch my church, or now, and then COVID, and it's like all that stuff. And so I think it all happened so fast within a generation and a half that we feel like the question about, I feel like I'm a little far off from your question, but was evangelical, I think we were not so long ago, at least from my 40-year-old perspective, that we did have the ontological relationality built into our lives and our religious practices. But it was also held together at the societal level with the water cooler and what you watched on, must see TV Thursday night or Friday. It was held together by, hey, Oprah said read this book, and so like most of people read it. And then it was held together. So you have these layers of things that were all easily kind of everyone's reading the newspaper. There's 3 news stations. Like
there was a common world, and that common world has broken down.
And I think the church was was not unaffected. And so now we went through that cycle so fast and everything's poof, that now we're realizing, oh, we need to find each other again. And so what's happened through the algorithm, say something like, I think this likely happens in other ways, but in different subcultures, they're not dealing with it so like maybe cognitively or reflectively, because the phenomenon wasn't birthed out of like a psychologist talking. So, but like, if millions of people experience this Jordan Peterson phenomenon, and of course, some of those are like just stay in the political level, but then there's like kind of the meaning level, which was a big part of his work. It's like, who do I talk to about that? I don't know. It's a little dicey to try to talk to some people in a certain season of, about this guy. So there's that. But then it's like you try talking about church, and he's like, well, he didn't even say he's a Christian. He doesn't even say he believes in God. So they're like, well, I don't know, talk about that. I need to find a place to talk about this. So then the shared experience had to find itself on YouTube. And that's something about the corner, that people then were able to find each other and then start developing that shared strata of experience within relationality. And a lot of those people were Christians or post-Christian or had been in the church or had been in ministry. And it was like trying to understand what just, what WTF happened, and then it does point back, it seems like, to, well, now we've dealt for over years, kind of the propositional realities. And I can just continue to do that, or I could actually like land somewhere in my life and kind of maybe leave those things on YouTube. And in certain ways, I think that's one of the ways that it's played out. And so then
I
you're
get
fine.
the sense
Yeah, go ahead.
So I get the sense from your story or what you're framing and how you're thinking about this is kind of like the ontological relationality was a kind of unreflected given. Like we did have a shared world, like we did have ontological relations, we did have Game of Thrones movie nights, we did have the office party, we did have college dorm experience, we did, you know, we did have local church practice, and that our world has, in some sense, we talk about personal destruction, but we talk about collective destruction, that
Yeah.
there's been a sort of like our world has been and so there's like a lack there, but there's also an opportunity to reflect on that lack.
Yep.
It's kind of like we're reflecting on the loss of the ontological relationality.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like where we are, and I feel like an honest, sober analysis of our situation is like the challenge of quote unquote reconstructing the world, the challenge of quote unquote reconstructing a world in which we have real physical social relations is like an enormous challenge, also because the way in which this is happening, like you already emphasized the corner being a YouTube phenomenon, is that we're trying to reconstruct in the virtual frame, like we're trying to reconstruct in a virtual medium. So how do you think about that? Maybe you could talk about maybe a little bit about conversations in the TLC about how the larger conversations unfolding, but also, yeah, how does this contradiction manifest in your life as well?
Conversations in the TLC is there seems to sometimes be this refrain of, you know, kind of the touch grass, like, okay, we're here doing this and we need to make sure that, is this helping my real life? There's kind of been that, am I a better husband or, you know, wife or person by participating in these conversations and following along and consuming the stuff? And so that's one kind of like conversational refrain that I've seen take place. And then the other would be the push for more embodied conferencing, you know, and why. So I went to ARC this year, the Peterson kind of thing, and then I went to Symbolic World last year, which is Jonathan Peugeot's thing, and then I'm actually going to go to something like a this little corner of the internet conference, which is around this other idea that Vanderklay has worked through, is this idea of Estuary, which is a conversation protocol. And they really believe that this should be done in person as much. And so there's actually networks of estuary meetings that happen all over the West, really. And I know one guy was trying to start one in China, actually, that I had a conversation with. And it's a conversation protocol. And what I think is so good about it, and related to even going back to the water cooler, is what you do when everybody's watching different algorithms and different things. And so what happens is people can bring those, what's been kind of top of mind, front of mind for you this week or this month idea. And no one else may actually know what you're who you watched and what you're talking about. But there's an opportunity for you to pitch that as kind of the idea, as an idea for discussion. And then people can kind of vote on it. And then sometimes, regardless of if your idea gets the vote, a lot of times it's brought in through synthesis within the conversation as a whole. And so so Paul has pushed this idea, and he's partnered with a guy named John Van Donk, and he does kind of these little estuary tours. If you're kind of close to him, he'll show up when you're trying to start one of them. Like, I know he went up to Washington for one, because he's on the West Coast. And so I think that through the TLC, there's like this reflective, should we just be on here doing this only? Is this going to help me by itself? And then there's like, well, let's try some estuary, which is not, there's a lot of Christians in the corner of the internet, but it's not, estuary isn't really a Christian, like, it's not church in the specific sense, how I would define church. So there's that. And then for me, wrestling with my own tension is, so I spent a long time after that failure in my life pretty isolated, pretty alone, in a very journey inward, lots of therapy, not really wanting for several years to really be known that much because I was very, embarrassed. And then I felt isolated. I was working weekend nights, and so I was not like in the general rhythm of, hey, there's this, Halloween festival in town. Can you come? No, I'm going to be working. Like, hey, there's this get together with a group of friends. Can you come? No, I'm working every weekend for 3 years and nights. So I'm also on like a different sleep schedule. And so I began to see even small talk in my life eroding. Like 15 minutes at a weekend get together with some kids in a birthday party, say you do 10 of those a year, that's actually a lot of like touch and contact and connection. And my kids were all small during that time of 3 kids. And so I began to see that like, wow, I am alone. And I was able to make a job change to rectify some of that after those 3 years. And again, COVID was also a part of that time. And again, there were, both my family's in-laws, we all live in the same town. I was involved in a small group at my church that I would meet. So it wasn't just completely, but there was enough to where I noticed the major difference. And partially because I had lived as in like pastoral work, it's all about, this kind of relationship with people. And then I started to try to reintegrate. And then after about 6 years since I had been involved in church, we got this new pastor and he was asking me about helping with the music, which I hadn't done in a very long time. And so my wife and I were talking about it, and we kind of dipped our toe into that reality. And without going into any more details, not for us, not in our relationship, but our relationship to that church kind of destructed. And it wasn't, again, that's a very personal and long story I can't really go into, but that is a part of this question of like, okay, well, what do I do now? And we ended up with a group of people meeting for 2 years, about 30 people. And I help lead it. And we're about to become part of an actual Christian denomination, part of like an institutional denomination. And we hired a pastor who actually was the pastor that fired me 8 years ago. So like trust, relationship, community. Yesterday, I spent all day on one of the people who's likely going to be like one of our elders at the church. There was some really bad tornadoes that went through Arkansas this weekend. And one of his house was basically destroyed. And so yesterday I was on his farm with almost 30 people in that little church community, just like cleaning up, and we were chainsawing limbs off of fences and rebuilding fences. And it was like, I don't want to be anywhere else right now. This is exactly where I want to be, with these people. And so that would be how, like, I want to continue doing this stuff because it is an expression and an outline of wrestling with certain ideas, and there's relationality, and it's reintegrating a part of my life, a kind of a public facing part of my life that I used to have. And then, but there's also this other thing here that, and they operate at 2 different speeds. And it's like, I'm understanding that, and I'm seeing that, and I'm realizing that's okay, and it's actually good. And so that's been that wrestling with.
Well, the online's like going at the speed of thought. Like it's going at it breaks down space and time basically, because
Yep.
I mean, look like what we're doing right now, and
Exactly.
then you're emphasizing the radically local, spaces and times in which human reality has operated since humans have existed. And it's just such a disorienting place to be in between those 2 worlds at the same time, and to hold that contradiction. I like that you pointed towards not just sort of what I take to be the virtual, digital, public facing idea of the TLC, but also the estuary as kind of something physical behind the scenes that's happening in local context. I believe there's also estuary chapters in Europe as well.
Yes, there is. Yeah.
So
Yep.
yeah, so it's not just in North America. Um, why would you distinguish estuary from a church? And one of the reasons I'm asking that question is because in the portal, that's kind of one of the questions we're trying to point towards is, what is a church? How do we distinguish between what is a church and what isn't a church? So, for example, on the far end of the spectrum, you could say someone who's devoutly Orthodox would say that a Catholic or a Protestant church isn't a church, or it's not the one true
Right.
church.
Right.
And then, on the other hand, you could have, I know in Peter Rollins' work, probably his definition of a church is so broad that any Christian might say that's not a church, right?
Yep.
So basically the question is, why would you say estuary is not a church? And I guess positively speaking, what is estuary, and how would you imagine its functional relationship to potentially church-like activities?
So, as a person who, claims a lowercase Orthodox Christian practice and faith, this even came up in our little community. I think that the baseline, and you can get more broad on this. I'll say why okay, I'm trying to frame this. Okay. I believe that ultimately for it to be church, like Christian church, it needs either the sacraments or the ordinances at the very baseline, which are communion and baptism. Of course, the Catholics have like 7 sacraments. I don't know how many the Orthodox have, but at the baseline, there's these practices. And I would make then a distinction that there is a line between seeing them as sacramental, as there's something real that happens between man and God with grace that happens through those practices. And then there's a line underneath that says these practices are only symbolic. There's not anything really happening. They represent something that's already happened to you spiritually. And I know that seems like a small distinction, maybe, but I would say that is also partially a reason for parts of deconstruction, because if everything is just if it's only metaphor, then again, like ideas can just change. But if you actually think something real is happening, and if you look at the church globally, charismatics are maybe the fastest growing. And the distinction that I would say something, of course, there's like this energetic engagement and the powerful music and all that kind of stuff, but they blatantly believe that something real happens, that there's something real between God and man happening. And on the flip side of it, you look at something like Orthodoxy, they believe very seriously that something real is happening. It can also just be a cultural participation for many people too. And that's at all levels, at all churches and all that stuff. But for me, my perspective is that something that will take you to a sacred reality within Christianity, for me, represents the church. Like something definitionally. And I would, at this point in my life, say that a better way to grip that would be through having some level of a sacramental theology. So then the question of something like Rollins or, and again, I'm making exclusive claims. Well, you have to have these to be, So then is a church just a meeting of people together? And I think that like you could call college church, or you could call any lecture series. And that's also why I think part of that sacramental line, if you look at the meme of evangelicalism as something like a 4-song mini concert and a TED Talk, then by definition, anything like I just said, like a lecture or a gathering could be
Yep.
considered a church. And so that's why I say if you cross that sacramental line, then you say, well, something else actually has to happen
Mm.
for this to be church. And that would be, I credit even John Vervaeke, even though he would have this very broad definition of how people approach the sacred, which I would actually agree with him on. I don't think that, again, I'm talking about a Christian church. I'm not talking about the only way to approach sacredality or something like that. And so I wonder, even within that perspective of something like Vervaeke, with something related to Rollins or the other guy that you had on Christianity and Transition, like Deconstruction, what was his name?
Tim Palmer?
Yeah, small groups. I even heard a part of that conversation, but like that was like there was almost a yearning and a longing between him and Brendan for how do you get the people together? And we've talked about new atheist church and why does it not ever seem to kind of get to that one
Right.
next level? And so I'm kind of trying to outline my thesis for why that is.
You seem to be pointing towards something ontologically real happening at least in regards to the belief of the people gathering.
Yes. Yeah. And so, and again, if you
So
just
for Rollins, that ontology is an ontology of lack.
yeah, help me with that a little bit.
So like I think like the main like how I would make sense, and like here I would frame this kind of in Christian atheist terms, that here would be my hypothesis. Most mainline Christian churches would believe something real is happening with an ontologically full reality or a substantial reality.
At least doctrinally.
Yeah, sure. But that belief holds people together.
Yes.
And I think that Rollins, as kind of like, you said something, I think, in the title of our previous conversation on your channel, like Christian atheism at the end of Protestantism or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like you follow it's basically like following the historicity of Christianity. So like this is how I like from Orthodoxy to Catholicism to Protestantism, and that there's kind of in that process an emptying out of the full ontological reality and a confrontation with lack. Like that what we share isn't like this full reality, but what we share is a fundamental lack.
Yep.
And that this is Christian atheist and not just atheist, in the sense that atheists kind of don't give the full existential and ontological weight to that lack, which is that actually that lack is, there's an ontological transformation that comes with being with that lack. And now that could be, for example, you mentioned previously fasting, for example. Now fasting is a mode of lack.
Yep.
Abstinence is a mode of lack.
Yep.
Right? So like there are these like practices, like pyrotheology is like there are these practices for becoming, let's say, more integrated with lack than sort of like trying to cover over the lack with like a fullness. Now in liberal secular culture, that might be covered over with like a car or a bank account or a hot partner or or a college degree or something that gives you an ontological fullness or something that you understand to be giving you an ontological fullness. So the idea, I think, in Rollins' work is that we commune through that lack and that's real. So I just want to say like that maybe that what now we could make this distinction that actually where Rollins' work and where, say, the Orthodox meet is in the belief of some ontological real that is the basis for a communion.
Yep.
Does that make sense? How I'm saying it?
Yeah, because I think that one of my early videos was like the singularity of when the East meets the West. And I mean, I get that picture of, it's the snake eating its tail. I don't know the learned definitions of what that, and the deeper implications of that symbol. I know there are plenty, but it's just kind of what comes to mind, even related to what you're talking about. It's like at the end of complete destruction, at the end of complete deconstruction, in the fullness of lack, in the Nietzschean reality, God is dead. and then you have this like mirror of like the full Christian life, you know, the full liturgical life of every moment of your existence is filled or something. And at the end of both those things, it's something like something is real, transcendentally, sacredly real. And you're both meeting at that point or something. That's how like you get to the end of it and you say, well, is there something real in the complete nothing? Is there something real about that? And I mean, I can't help when I'm listening to that definition for me in my framework, like that all throughout the idea, even in the Christian gospel, is this idea of lack, which is there is a lack between humanity and God. There's a in that in sin is an idea of lack, like it's a lack of our ability to you know, whatever, if we want to say live perfectly, whatever perfect means. I don't have a great you know, but it's
Rollins actually says original lack instead of original sin.
yeah, I would say yeah.
So
And
that
so
idea is connected.
yeah, and so I definitely think, and when we've talked, you know, why I say at the end of Protestantism is because that's like at the end of that tale, like it's the end of here that, so you know, so the thing, some of the major critiques of people about Protestantism is like, oh, look what Protestantism has done. Oh man, we don't need to touch that. But it's kind of like, well, depending on where you're at with how you if you have some belief in how if God is sovereign, but then you know I know another big part of the conversation you had last week or within the section 1 of Christianity and transition is like God is in process. So you then have this idea of was this Protestant Pandora like outside of a plan of some kind from God? That was there a reason that it would have been allowed to just to come to that ultimate Western lack, even where the West in a certain sense meets the East in that regard, because that's where from my limited understandings of like kind of Buddhist meditation, it is try to remove everything or come to that space. And so
like the illusion of substance or the samsara.
Yeah, I think something like that is, you know, that type of self-emptying in a way is like, well, here you have at the end of Protestantism and in some Nietzschean regard, like it's all where you're running into the East in that way, I think, in some kind of symbolic way. So I have, and so then I happen to think like maybe like Pete does, is that there's something to that. There's something, and we could take that to the whole point of even that destructive, like if your life explodes and there's like your identity and your career and your merit, like it all seems gone. Like, well, there's what's in that moment. So.
Well, I just wanted to say in regards to the way in which this lack is being conceived, because this is actually relevant in the sense that this Christianity and Transition series is building up towards Philosophy Portal is going to be having an event with Peter Rollins at Wake Festival, is you were saying in the Christian gospel this idea of lack, that there's a lack between humanity and God. The idea that's developed by Zizek in Christian atheism, and I think that this is, if you go into like Altizer or this tradition of thought, the idea is that what Christ represents is not just that there's a lack between humanity and God, but that God himself lacks.
Right.
And that's now the idea that there's a lack between humanity and God, as far as I understand it, this creates the potential problem of humans engaging in a disciplinary pious activity to try and become one with God. Because there's a lack between us, so we have to close that lack between us and God. Whereas the idea that God himself lacks means that actually where we lack is where we are in contact with the divine, so to speak. So it's not like that we need to engage in a disciplinary pious activity to become one with God. It's that in exploring lack itself, we are already connected, quote unquote, with God. And so like there's a kind of like tremendous irony in that, which is that like people misrecognizing when God is close and when God is far.
Yeah.
Which and that's kind of like, bring this back around, like that's why I was emphasizing the personal destruction, because
Mhm.
it's like my thought is like, so like maybe like there's a mirror or a parallax between us, because like you grew up Christian but I grew up secular.
Yes.
But like, what to me, what unifies is like the subjective disposition in relationship to that subjective destitution or that personal destruction, because you can find the same truth there,
Yeah.
like that God is close there somehow.
Yes. Well, and to that point, like I think now is Pete, is he Scottish, Irish? What is he?
Irish.
I
Yeah,
love that.
don't call him Scottish. Don't
Okay.
call him Scottish.
Oops.
No, I'm
I
joking,
just
joking, joking.
well, so yeah, I'm half Irish, or no, I'm a quarter Irish. I found out, or yeah, recently I've been to Ireland now, skipped right
Okay.
over Scotland. So okay,
Yeah.
hung out in Galway. So,
Nice.
uh, so the that word lack, I can just hear it in the way that maybe in his intonation. There's something to that to me that gives it something that's not within the parlance of where I'm from. And so it creates like this distinct reality that how then I relate it to from my kind of theological framework is that God actually had to make himself lacking. So you have kind of these two ideas. One is that
Yeah.
there's like a reality that, well, God has lack in him, so that then we relate to God that way. And I think my twist, or lowercase orthodox perspective, would put it as that God made himself to have lack so that we could enter into relationship in that image, in that person, and in that reality of Jesus. And again, like I've struggled with how to, when I had that powerful experience with this image of Abraham, right? It was hard for me to even know what to do with the Christian cross and gospel for a while. There was like, at least within the framework that I had been in. And I know we talked in our other conversation that really the symbol of the crucifix was how I first kind of, because there was a God understands suffering, which God understands what it means to lack wholeness in that image. And then in recent times, in some conversations I've been in, there's this idea about what does that symbol and that idea about God have to do with power? And it's actually this idea of like God, either there's some kind of ontological framework that God has limited power, or that God limited his own power in a sense through that image. And either way, you're back dealing with that reality of like dealing with how we as humans deal with our own lacking in our ability to always clean our room, Jordan Peterson. And like and and then the other piece of it that you mentioned was well, I can't I've lost it on that thread. There was something else that you said there.
I'm definitely following you on the basically our ethical relationship to lack, I think.
Yeah. And but there was another piece, but I've lost it at this point.
Hmm. Well, I mean, there's a lot we can play with there, but maybe we can bring it back around to what I originally wanted to point towards, which is what is the relationship between Estuary and
Oh,
church
there we go.
in regards to the personal relationships, the physical grounding. And really, I think that I want to emphasize not only just the strangeness and the weirdness of our time, which is, of course, hyper strange and hyper weird, but like the challenge of rebuilding the ontological relationality in a world that is structurally so different and has become so different so quickly from the reality you were describing of like the Game of Thrones movie nights and stuff like that. Like I feel like that's already like vanished, and like and almost like, can we bring that back? How do we think about bringing something back? Yeah, all of that.
So I've had this. I don't know if it's unique, but in 2016, I was actually getting some job coaching from a. He's now a fairly prominent podcast producer. He works for Christianity Today. He produced this series called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, which went pretty big last 2 years ago or so, relating to this phenomenon that seems to happen within Christian leadership of problems, of misuses of power, and those types of things. I got some job coaching from him, and I was describing kind of some of the successes that I'd had traveling and doing this music stuff, and yet I still live in this town of 10,000 people that I grew up in rural Arkansas. I'm like an hour and a half from our state capital, Little Rock. I'm 2 hours from Memphis. Not a whole lot in between. And he's like, man, that kind of reminds me of like Wendell Berry, who's a fairly notable American, contemporary American author who had some success, and then he just ends up going back to this kind of farm town in Kentucky and working out of that space. And for me, I had regrets that I didn't like try to make it in like Nashville and contemporary Christian music or something like that, or like I had friends that have, and so I look at what's happened and where I'm at, and there's several pieces related to this, which is I live in this, my wife and I both grew up in this town. Both of our family have, like, my dad grew up here, her dad grew up here. There's history within this community. And I look around, and if you do the numbers, like, that's not very common. If you relate that to the size and the ratios of city population and international travel and the American spirit of, go west and everything and seek your fortune and all that stuff. And I found something very rich here, even in my humiliation, is the weirdness of that, the fact that I was so known. And I haven't related this to Estuary, but you're talking about like the Reconstruction, and I just think that there's something very powerful in that, and that I find in a certain sense we are easily distracted by, obviously, by our digital, the phone, but even in a how do you cultivate trust amongst a people? And things can build trust quickly, like a disaster and those types of things, but also there's this other level of trust that's just built over. You can't fake that, like, the girl whose company put on my roof to my house was my 4th grade girlfriend. Like, you can't fake that. Like, I've known you for my whole life. Like, what do I do with that? And she gave me a $5,000 cheaper quote than the guy that didn't know me.
Yeah, you were way better with girls in grade 4 than me. I didn't have a girlfriend in grade 4. Jesus.
So I'm just saying, like, that's a weird and unique experience that I don't like. I don't. And so with Estuary is a step, I think, of recultivating of trust, because there's an intimacy to it. If you're like bringing something that is, you've been thinking about, and it may not be politically popular, it may not be, but it's something that might be really interesting to you, and you're in a community of people that you trust to at least say, hey, this might be interesting to talk about. It's a big deal. And then what could happen if you're part of that Estuary group for 3-5 years? Like, anything that you devote yourself to over that kind of period of time, people that have devoted themselves to this little corner of the internet over the course of 7-8 years now, there's real trust that gets built up. And these people start meeting in real life. And so I think that's part of that.
Like a compound interest.
Yes. And and we're kind of bankrupt in ways of doing that, because the other piece about the corner is that there's, and you listen to that conversation I had with Luke Thompson when we talked about status and these
Yeah,
things,
that was
like
a great combo. Yeah.
there's realities of within that culture that is a little bit anarchist. They're a little bit anti status, yet status is acknowledged as a thing that draws people together. So it's like this wrestling intention there. And as a result of that, there's also, you're giving voice to people that maybe don't have a lot of power recognition, and all of a sudden, like, you put your face on the screen, some people know you, like, and people think you might have an interesting idea, and they bring that into another conversation. And you haven't written a book, you don't have a successful YouTube channel, you don't have a popular Substack, but, and there's, we mentioned, I don't know if it was within this conversation, but the author Martin Shaw, who recently became a Christian, he spoke at Symbolic World last year, and he threw out this idea of, like, what does it mean to be famous for, think about maybe what does it mean to be famous for 5 miles? And I really think, like, within the corner, and even in my own channel, like, it feels like I can't, if I try to talk to somebody, like even yesterday when we were cleaning up this stuff, and I was trying to explain a situation where how I got invited to this concert in Nashville by this people I met who watch my podcast, like, made no sense. It's not like people are looking at me, oh man, look at Christian. It's like, no, it doesn't make any sense. But in a certain little corner of 5 miles of the internet, like, I have people know who I am. and that's a pretty good place. Like, and it's not that I think that there aren't things that come with, like, building something or being known by a lot, but I would say that there's something to that also related to what is this ontological, what is the scale of trust, and what is the scale of community and those types of things. And I mean, Vanderklay's been kind of, in the laboratory with some of that stuff.
Yes. No, I think that, okay, so again, there's, I mean, part of me's thinking, is the word church getting in the way of what people need the most, which is just relation. Again, it's back to this ontological relationality, and how much does the word church or the idea or the concept of church help with that, or how much does that get in the way of that? But, like, ultimately, like, what I'm sensing into is that the collapse or the destruction of a certain social order, probably primarily mediated by the internet, like, and digital connectivity and smartphones, obviously. Like, in my work, I've been thinking for a long time about metasystem transitions, that we were in a previous system and that system's changing or breaking down, and that a new system's being reconstituted out of that, primarily, again, communication wise anyway, mediated by the internet. And that you've emphasized, sort of like on an existential personal level, the loneliness that people feel here. You gave some great examples about recognizing even small talk evaporating and realizing, oh, like, I don't have connections to anyone. I mean, that's happened to me in my own ways as well.
Yeah.
How I've dealt with it sometimes is, like, trying to put a perspective shift on loneliness. Like, I've talked about, like, going from loneliness to aloneness, and, like, seeing alone time, and, like, and I've also cultivated that for a while, is, like, actually seeing being alone as, like, I quite enjoy it in some ways. Of course, I need connection, I need social relationships, but like that actually there's something valuable. I think, like, that your social relationships can be better if you're good with being alone as well. Like, if you can't be alone, that's also problematic. So, like, I want to put that dimension on things. But, like, just to emphasize, going back to this problem of ontological relationality, and, like, constructing a bridge between these insanely different worlds, like the high speed world of the speed of thought on the internet, and, like, being connected to people anywhere in space and time, and then the physical grounding of that, and, like, that we're trying to build a bridge from these between these two spheres, and we don't quite yet know what that bridge is made of, or what it looks like, or how to maintain it over time. But I feel like that's to me what I see, and what we're sensing into. But yeah, any ideas that you have in relationship to that?
Sometimes being alone is like a season of life. That's how it's likely that you won't be that alone forever. You know, the way you're feeling. I mean, for me, when you're in it, like, but I kind of felt that way for at least 5 years. And that's also what's interesting about jumping onto this. And even as I'm like scrolling through my text messages today, I was just like, my goodness. I was lucky to get a text like from anybody else besides my wife or my parents for like a month at a time. Like, I mean, like, and I was just like, wow. And so, but I don't look back at that time that I was lonely or alone. And I do think there's a distinction there, because one is about how you feel and one is like a perspective on like your situation. And I think that there was a lot of good that came from that season, and how I'm able hopefully to connect with people as a result. And that is, again, I go back and reference this this work by Janet Hagberg about the critical journey stages in the life of faith, and that journey inward, that is, it says the stage involves a real turn inward. It's often occasioned by crisis, either of life or faith. It may involve doubting, wrestling with God, the search for integrity before Him, for God and not just answers. It may often involve apparent abandonment of faith, even. And I think that it's hard to go into the places of your own person when you have constant barrage of text messages and emails, maybe, and so like during that season, I look back now and a lot of the work that I was able to do through, therapy and small community and in my marriage took place during that time. So, but the reality is, like, church, the realities of does church get in the way? I think it definitely gets in the way, or has, and it's really this funny thing, because at least in the States, something that was defined as the seeker movement, when you're like, they were trying to reach people who were in that state of seeking, that something akin to what maybe Estuary is. But what's interesting, Estuary is for a lot of seekers to come together and, like, deal with ideas in a relational space. What the Protestant church tried to do, or the evangelical church tried to do, is they tried to mash these things together. Let's make church a seeker space. And so when you do that, you either like are going to either, or is church a, is it only for the discipled? Is it only for the people that maybe understand the symbols or these things? And so there was, not only was there, like, there was a Protestant iconoclasm that took place, historically, and there were wars in Europe over that. But this was a different kind of iconoclasm, because it was like, we don't want to put any crosses on the wall because that's going to, like, scare people away from church, which isn't what iconoclasm was, but it was its own version of that. And I kind of experienced some of that, 10, 15 years ago in this other church that I was connected to. And something that I'm experiencing related to this is that these things, we've tried to, like, mash them together. The digital with church, bringing church onto the digital. Is church a small group? No, small group. This is the real church because this is real relationship. Church is like, that's something else. Like, this is the meat and the potatoes. And it's like, I kind of think that these things need a little bit of, like, their own space, their
differentiation,
their own category, instead of and so, like, this idea, I think that the West has largely forgotten, or I would say it's something to do more with like desacralization. Like we've made desacralization sacred, which is like an inversion of it. And so we don't even have a category for sacred hardly. We know a lot about transcendence with MDNA, and ayahuasca and like and even music like
Psychedelic
yeah. So
transcendence.
and even if you go to like Vegas and you go to that new like Sphere and like YouTube's down there and they're playing and there's like image, this is transcendent. This is transcending reality. But and even within the what I call like the modern church worship movement, like was a very tied to trying to figure out how to create transcendent experiences through arena rock. And but this idea of sacred was kind of like left in the like I don't know how long ago it was kind of abandoned. And so again, going back to like Vervaeke's work is like, so this talking about delineating is I see communion in fractals, like to use Jonathan Peugeot's kind of framework on that. There is like actual communion, and then there's like fractals of that actual communion all the way out. And that would be like your communion at a small group get together is a fractal of our communion with God, but it is no less communion. But it's not like the deepest, realist part of communion or something like that, but it is real and it is deep. And then how you commune, like maybe in your town, civically, there's a type of cohesion and communion at a Friday night football game or something like that. And
but the deeper communion would be in this sacred, case, Orthodox church,
in the sacred, yeah,
in the sacred, which is the church.
Yes, that's what I would say. But that doesn't mean that there aren't like there aren't fractals of something that represent church out from that. Like there are elements because you can share a meal with people in a beautiful candlelight or like a lovely dinner with wine and bread. And that is also communion. And that is also, and I think in almost all and even you could even say God is present there. But I don't think that generally you enter into some kind of sacred reverential reality in that space. Generally, I'm sure it can happen. But so again, this idea of like this distinction between transcendence and sacred. And so, yeah, like I would say something like Estuary, something like is a fractal of communion. And someone could.
I think that's what we were. I think that makes it clear.
Okay.
No, but yeah, go on. But I think that helps me understand how you're making sense of Estuary. So like my interpretation would be, if we're in this space of let me see how you track this. We're in this space of loneliness. Our worlds have been blown apart. There are certain people who are gravitating together online in various different communities, some of them Christian, some of them post-Christian, some of them adjacent to these spaces. And then we're trying to build, like Estuary is an example of an in-between space of the physical and the digital, where we're trying to build the seed forms of trust through conversational dynamics, dialogical dynamics. And that ultimately downstream of this would be something like the construction of a local church, which would be the deepening then of that process.
It could be. I'm not going to say, or that people end up going to church, or people end up finding ways. I think that, yeah, there's the word evangelism, evangelical. They come from this etymology of the good news. Evangelion is the good news, and so I don't think, in a sense, that Estuary is evangelistic in the sense that, oh man, if we can just get them to Estuary, then they'll walk through the doors of the church. Like,
okay, because I have heard that a little bit.
Well, I think Paul's doing Estuary in his Sunday school classroom. So But
Mhm.
like,
I've heard other people say that at least, I mean, I'm sure that there's a multiplicity here.
sure.
Like there's many different local estuaries, and I'm not sure how coordinated they are. But so you're saying not all, so correct me if I'm wrong, that the goal of estuary is not pointing towards church,
No, I
but
think,
that could be a possible result.
yeah, yeah. And I think that I if you're paying attention to certain figures where they're, if you've paid attention to them long enough, mainly like the Peterson Peugeot pipeline of people just showing up to some high
Yeah,
tradition church, they're not going to estuary. They're like just
they're
finding
going
this.
to church.
They're going to church, and then there's some of those are young men or whatever, and then there's this other part about like, what do I do with these ideas? I want to kind of flesh these out. Where can I do that at? You know, and again, like to try to frame um like something like Alcoholics Anonymous, and is more similar to Estuary in a certain way because they're very grassroots, very, not top down. And you're not, are you dealing with a lot of money in these places? And is there a lot of food, or are they organizing events that take a budget to execute or something, like, and uh no, and also, do those things for some people, is that their most sacred reality? It might be, and I don't want to denigrate that. And this is coming from somebody who's biased, that spent the majority of his Sundays at a church for work, even, but even, like, so it's like that rhythm in my life is, and even thinking about how these things are planned and executed. So I have like some kind of, I don't know if bias is the right word, but it's my, it's a long part of my reality. So, but is the purpose of this? I don't think the stated purpose is that. I think the stated purpose is to deal with said meaning crisis this is a way to help with people that might find themselves deconstructed, might find themselves in a quasi nihilistic reality because you don't have these spaces that help cultivate meaning in your life. And that could be a start. And I don't know, I think I know that that's part of it.
So again, I'm getting the zero level is the relationship between ontological relationality and the construction of meaning. And however we go about that, however we do that, that's the sort of the focal point. So I mean, I think we're going to be struggling with and grappling with these questions a lot in the portal. And just again, next week in the portal, we're going to have a session about what is church. And, I know for me, one of the things I want to talk to Peter Rollins about at Wake Festival this year is about church of contradiction, church as a contradiction. There's also going to be a Christian atheist conference at Philosophy Portal in April where I'll be exploring those themes as well. I'm also trying to just grapple with how to make sense of these different spaces, because I suppose how I most relate to it coming from a space that's not, let's say, explicitly Christian, is that there's this gravitation online with people that you have affinities with. Then there's attempts to sort of create events that bring you into physical communion with each other, but they're fleeting. And what's still missing is a kind of sort of stable, local, long-term organization.
The binding.
The long-term binding in local communities, which probably human beings thirst for and long for, because of our evolutionary history, because it's helpful when raising families and building long-term connections. And I guess that's what I see at the moment as the mega challenge. And hopefully this isn't too much of a digression or taking us in a different direction, but I kind of wanted to ask you about how you see metagelicalism as a concept distinct from evangelicalism, or kind of like maybe even a higher order version of evangelicalism, as kind of trying to mediate this process. Like, that's how I understand Paul Vanderklay's use of metagelicalism, is that it's trying to explain the way, in perhaps the American context, perhaps in a larger Western context, the way in which people are gravitating towards orthodoxy and traditional Catholicism, but that the way in which people are discussing and relating to these ideas is kind of more in the form of evangelicalism, like you were saying, like the marketplace of ideas. And so, like, metagelicalism is trying to explain this kind of radical inclusion of all different forms of Christian faith.
Yeah. So the first part that you hit on there, religio and liturgy, which ligature is also connected to, these things that bind us together that you hit on. And I have been drawn to more uses of liturgy because, again, like in this form that I had participated in with this kind of transcendent individual experience, if I can get the frequencies of the psychotechnology of modern worship to take you to this place, I've done my job. But what I began to recognize was like, man, this is just a lot of me. There's not a lot of relationship even happening in this thing. I'm hoping that you have a transcendent experience. And so I was in a situation, I started playing around with responsive readings and read and response. And so there, within that kind of setting, begin to see that there was some other piece of what can happen when you gather to a place like this that can happen through something like that. But even that, there's like a rhythm of a binding of your life, you know, in that meeting that can happen again, like you're saying, these things, you come together and then there's this meeting and there's the longing for connectedness, and let's figure out how to make more connectedness. And in finding this, the commons of YouTube or the commons of this algorithm, and like, okay, well, we found each other here, and I think there's a reality of needing to have the catharsis of togetherness. And so I think that that's true and must happen. And I think that's also a part of the metagelical idea of what's happening. So say something like, so my conversations like with Brendan Graham Dempsey that I had was this distinction that I think like it seemed from me, from my perspective, like his desire is like, okay, let's be in this space. And what is after this? What is the thing? And that could be cultivated and developed. And I guess from like my perspective that I was seeing was like, well, maybe that happens someday. From my perspective, I don't see that happening near as quickly as something like the people that are trying to cobble together the meaning of their lives related to their life's journey within Christian traditions, let's call it, within certain conservative and moderate traditions that are just not ever going to be that wide open, because some of that's temperamental, I think.
Right.
And and so then it's like, well, what do you do here? Because so you have these levels. Like, well, can we be more radically inclusive within this section and subculture that we're in? And so that's how I kind of view it. And I'm kind of have come and resigned or resolved to be within that and be okay, like, because that's just my reality. And so, you know, I don't think it meets the meta of fully beyond, but it's beyond it's meta in beyond a certain framework that has existed for a long time of, you know.
There's a dialectic of constraints.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Like, there's a dialectic of constraints in the sense that, like, you know, we're not going, like, the idea of metagelicalism might be distinct from a form of thinking about religion in which you obliterate all the boundaries of different religions altogether and just sort of have a vague but you know, this, why I think it's meaningful is that there's an engagement with the historicity of a real phenomenon, evangelicalism, the marketplace of ideas within Protestantism. As far as I understand it, PVK is saying that it's a way for Protestants to overcome some of their distinctions and some of their differences, and that metagelicalism is trying to do that for Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox in a new ecology of ideas.
I think that's exactly right. And I mean, so when I went to Symbolic World and I saw the YouTube influencer Ruslan there, conservative YouTube guy,
Yeah.
I was like, oh, so Ruslan is now okay with Peterson. He's now okay with orthodoxy, and he's going to play. And he's like a straight up big Eva guy. Even though I know he's like Armenian in his history, and there's like Armenian Orthodox in his family history. I thought, okay, this is really fascinating. And another buddy of his, John, from the YouTube channel "What Do You Meme," which was like a Christian, like a more hip Christian apologetics channel. Both these channels are very large, and I was like, this is interesting here. And then I see Pints with Aquinas, who's got he's a Catholic YouTuber, and he's having Ruslan on, and he's having Jonathan Peugeot on. This has all happened in the last year, and I think Peterson is a big part of it. I think that he did something, because there was also this kind of cultural divide that he was dealing with, and there's all these people on that side of the cultural divide, and so yeah, I think that's and what the corner's been doing has been playing with that on a very on one level, and then you're seeing it now happen on these more public levels.
Okay, so I love it personally. And I'm going to be loving going into this with you in a month in the portal. So for those of you who are interested in getting involved, there'll be a link in the description to Christianity in Transition, which is a part of a larger exploration in the portal about simply that. And I see TLC as part of this phenomenon of Christianity in transition, and an important part of it. And as we've been discussing with Christian, his relationship to it, and some of the contradictions and some of the issues and some of the aspects of this that require further philosophical reflection will be the types of things that we're going to be diving into in April. So if you're interested in that, get involved. Links will be in the description. And Christian, I'll give you the last word in terms of how you see this process and maybe what you're looking forward to.
Well, yeah, I'm excited to join you next month in the part 2 of Christianity in Transition, and have some other friends join us as well. And this is what I hope for in the digital space. Is, you said at the speed of ideas. I've said something at like the speed of digital, and I think there's there's real connection there. And so this is exciting, and I hope that people will join us and join in and represent the corner, this little corner in this dialogue. And that's a big honor for me, because they've put that community, that subculture has put a lot of trust into me, and so hopefully I will honor that as well.
All right, everyone, it's been Cadell Last with Christian Baxter, and hope you guys join us next month in the portal. The next 2 months at the portal will be exploring Christianity in Transition. This 2-month process will involve 2 major sections. To learn more or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online. This year at Philosophy Portal, Dimitri Kroimans is hosting a year-long Slovenian school reading group focused on the works of Mladen Dolar and Alenka Zupancic. For the first half of 2025, we will be reading A Voice and Nothing More by Dolar, and in the second half, we will be reading The Odd One In by Zupancic. Members of the portal get instant access, but you can also get involved by becoming a member of Dimitri Kroimans' Substack or Patreon. To learn more or to sign up, see philosophyportal.online. This year at Philosophy Portal, we are hosting a year-long course led by Professor Terence Blake focused on Deleuze and analysis. This course will be attempting to develop the connection as opposed to the rift between Deleuzean philosophy and Lacanian psychoanalysis. Members of the portal get instant access, but you can also sign up for the course as a standalone package. To learn more or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online.